Tonight excuse me. Good evening. Tonight we are excited to bring you one of the related events to the 2022 One Book, One Community title selection, The Night Watchman by Louise Erdrich. The mission of the One Book, One Community project is to encourage the entire Fargo-Moorhead community to read one book together. This year's program partners are the Fargo Public Library, the Moorhead Public Library, the West Fargo Public Library, the libraries of NDSU, MSUM, and Concordia College, the Historical and Cultural Society of Clay County, the Indigenous Association, and the Moorhead Area Public Schools Indian Education. On Thursday, October 27th at 7 p.m., Louise Erdrich will give an author presentation at the Centrum at Concordia College. Our major sponsor for her visit and the program series is the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment. Our other sponsors are on the screen behind me, and I will just let you read those. Tonight's event is the Muskrat and Long Knives, Understanding 1940s through 1960s U.S. Indigenous Relations as Portrayed in Louise Erdrich's The Night Watchman. Dr. Eric Gooding, an anthropology professor at Moorhead State University of Moorhead, will describe and contextualize U.S. Indigenous relations during the period of termination in the 40s through the 60s, with special attention given to the U.S. Ojibwe situation as presented in The Night Watchman. Dr. Gooding is a professor of anthropology at Minnesota State University Moorhead. His area of interests include anthropology of the arts, ethnohistory, visual anthropology, ethnomusicology, American Indians of the Great Plains and Prairies, including Lakota, Dakota, Assiniboine, and Stoney, and the Great Lakes, Meskwaki. All right, Dr. Gooding, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. So, what we are doing tonight is we are looking at this book, The Night Watchman. While it is a work of fiction, it is grounded in a historical reality. So the purpose of this presentation is just to give general readers of the Fargo, Moorhead, West Fargo area a basic understanding of that contextual experience. So I want to thank the One Book, One Community for inviting me to do this. Thank you. So my interest in these books and in this book comes from my undergraduate experience, where I was introduced to Erdrich's early works, Love Medicine, Beat Queen, and Tracks. And it was interesting when I read them as an undergraduate, particular Beat Queen. I didn't understand what that was. And then when I moved here and was introduced to the sugar beet industry, I learned rather quickly what that was. So what we're looking at with her writing is really a contextualization that includes our area. In fact, as you read The Night Watchman, there are references to what is now Minnesota State University Moorhead, which at the time of that's portrayed in The Night Watchman, it was Moorhead Teachers College. So there's references to our region throughout all of her works, really. So anthropologically speaking, we see these kinds of works, we tend to call them ethnographic fiction. And I think it probably begins with the writing of Ella Deloria, who was a Dakota woman, who wrote a book, Water Lily. And while it is a piece of fiction, it was designed to teach her culture, Dakota culture, to middle school children. And when I read Erdrich's books, I get the same feeling, because throughout her writings and throughout The Night Watchman, we are introduced to various aspects of Ojibwe culture, and they're excellent teaching tools in addition to being fiction. So here you see on the map Turtle Mountain, which is where the majority of the events take place. So she is looking at the context of Turtle Mountain and the context of her grandfather, her maternal grandfather, in relation to the U.S. government's policy of termination, which I'll get to shortly. So let's look at the author. She's an enrolled member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians. She is Ojibwe through her maternal line. She was born here in, well, I said here in Minnesota. I'm so used to lecturing across the river. She was born in Minnesota, but her parents taught at the BIA boarding school in Wahpeton, North Dakota, just down the road from us. And this is a picture of her maternal grandfather, who was tribal chairman at Turtle Mountain during this time period. So she is relying heavily on her personal experiences, the experiences of her family, of her people, and she is infusing real life events in a fictionalized story. So let's start with some basic things. Terminology is important to understand and respect. So when we look at Turtle Mountain, so already I said Turtle Mountain as the home reservation. That is just one location where groups of people that live on that reservation live in a wide range of places. So you will hear them refer to themselves as Anishinaabe. You will hear the word Ojibwe used. You will hear Chippewa used. And depending on where you're at, the preferred term may vary. So you can see on this map that there is a large expanse of territory where Ojibwe people live. In Minnesota, there's large populations. In Manitoba, Wisconsin, Ontario, even over into Montana. And we'll get to those here shortly. So Turtle Mountain is one of 5 reservations in North Dakota: Sisseton, Standing Rock, Spirit Lake, Turtle Mountain, Fort Berthold. And how did they get there? How did Ojibwe people get there? Because I think most people think of Ojibwe people living in the forests. And for the most part, that is where they are. So in the mid to late 1700s, there's an economic shift. There is a shift of certain individual families, small groups of Ojibwe peoples living in the very western edge of the forest in Minnesota, up into Manitoba. And they are leaving their homes seasonally to move out onto the prairies. And they're doing that for fur trade issues, for trapping, things like that, trading. And eventually, those movements become more than just seasonal. So as we move through the 1700s, we find larger family groups, other groupings moving out onto the plains and living there permanently. So that right around 1800, 1805, there is really this new variant of Ojibwe people that have adapted to the plains environment. And they are living in typical plains dwellings, teepees, things like that. And really, even by the early 1800s, there are groups of Ojibwe that are being associated with the Turtle Mountain area already. The U.S. government isn't dealing with them, so they're dealing with other tribal peoples. In fact, the U.S. government refers to them, as you can see on the slide, oftentimes refer to these Plains Ojibwe people as being landless. And that begins in the 1800s and really is still an issue for Ojibwe people, some of them to the present day, where they are still without recognized reservation or land bases. So the Turtle Mountain people leave the forests in the 1700s and begin this process of transitioning to a plains lifestyle. And by the early 1800s, they are full-time buffalo hunting, culturally speaking, plains peoples. Eventually, the U.S. government, through this process of removal and of the creation of reservations, begins doing land cessions, begins moving people around. Reservations begin forming in Minnesota and the Dakotas. And you can see on this map, in 1882, the Turtle Mountain Reservation was established. The original reservation is what you see in orange, so much larger than the green, which was the reduced size that occurred 2 years after the reservation was established. So their land base shrank within 2 years of creating the reservation. But you can also see what was given up in the pink in 1863, and then in 1904, what was given up in the blue. So there's been different land cessions over time. So if we're looking at the Night Watchman, and we're looking at it as this fiction work that has these historical truths in it, and it's about this experience of her grandfather and fighting termination, let's take a moment and walk through how the United States got to termination, okay? So Europeans arrive in the New World, and they have pre-existing experiences that they had while they were colonizing other continents. So when federal governments get involved, when kingdoms, kings, things like that, they had experience doing this in other regions of the world. So when Europeans arrive in the New World, the power dynamic, the power structure really favors the indigenous people. They're the ones with the experience. The outsiders don't have that skill set to hunt, to farm, to find food, any of that kind of stuff. It's a new environment for them. So initially, the indigenous peoples along the East Coast, they were more powerful. They didn't really see these new intruders to really be a threat. But over time, as we move through the 15, 16, 1700s, obviously that dynamic changes. And as outsider numbers increase, and with their technology, they begin really a three-pronged approach to indigenous people. And that's remove them, convert them, or eliminate them. So initially, as they are along the East Coast and they begin pushing into the continent, they just begin displacing groups and pushing them inland. And that was the earliest tactic. And then they bring the missionaries with them. So the idea early on is if we can convert the indigenous people to our religion, assimilate them into our culture, then they're on our side, and we don't have to worry about them. And when they begin doing these two approaches, they receive pushback from some indigenous groups. And that's when violence and warfare occur, and then we get the British, the French, the Spanish taking on this idea of elimination, so genocide. And this is what these European powers were doing all through the 15 and 1600s. By the American Revolution, the dynamic changes because the European powers are gone, and then we get the formation of the United States, and we get Canada up north. So it's different players, but a lot of the same ideas on how to deal with indigenous people. So here in the United States, we'll focus on this. So by 1890, the U.S. has established all of their reservations, and they've moved all indigenous peoples to these reservations. And then they start from 1890 to 1934, really this policy of assimilation. And this is laws, policies, prohibitions that are enacted at the reservation level, basically to attack all aspects of indigenous culture. So this is where you see the bans on religion, language, clothing, hair, any aspect of culture, it is being attacked. And the idea of the assimilation policy is simple, that when those reservations were created, they were created out of treaties. And the treaties laid out the specifics of the relationship between the U.S. government and, in this case, let's just say the Turtle Mountain people. So in those agreements, there are things the U.S. government is required to do by treaty. And we know that in many cases they didn't meet those obligations. But things like healthcare, education, stuff like that. Well, the U.S. government realized in the late 1800s that that was a financial burden on them. So their idea was basically if we can assimilate all indigenous people into mainstream American cultures, then we don't have to meet the treaty obligations because there are no indigenous people left. And since we signed the treaties with indigenous people, if they all become Americans and in mainstream, basically white culture of the time, then we don't have to pay the bills that we agreed that we would take care of. So the assimilation policy it's the boarding schools, it is all of that horrible experiences that the U.S. government put indigenous people through from 1890 to 1934. In 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act comes out, and this is an attempt really to stop the assimilationist policy, introduce different types of self-government, and to change how the policy and the relationship between the federal government and distinct tribal groups, how it would work. So we're in that time period, post-Indian Reorganization Act, post-Indian New Deal, when we get to 1952. And we get to the Relocation Act and 1954, the Termination Act. And they really go hand in hand. So what I mean by that is, by, say, 1950, we have the U.S. government looking backward toward their assimilationist ideas. So the idea, again, back then was to assimilate indigenous people so they were no longer indigenous, and we can then take the land, sell the land, make money off the land, and then not have to meet our treaty obligations, so we save money that way. So by 1950, we see the government returning to that assimilationist idea, and they come up with a couple different ideas. The first is the relocation, and I have a couple flyers. You can Google these are all over the internet. Come to Denver, the chance of your lifetime, and the one on the right's a little fuzzier, and that's one inviting people to come to Minneapolis. So Denver, Minneapolis, Los Angeles, there were multiple large cities that relocation served. But the idea was simple, and it's mentioned in The Night Watchman. Patrice's sister went to Minneapolis, and that was on this program. And the idea basically was that if we can't assimilate you in your community, we'll take you out of your community. We'll drop you in a big city and basically force you then to assimilate on your own, of your own choice. And it was billed as economic opportunities, things like that, but there was this side idea of the U.S. government working toward this assimilation idea. So relocation begins in 1952, and by 1954, termination comes about. And the idea is back to that same notion. It's the idea that if we can get out of our treaty obligations, the U.S. government saves money. So the U.S. government began looking at ways of basically taking away tribalness. So in the early 1950s, there were 3 preliminary studies done to look at the tribalness of all of the federally recognized tribal groups of that time period. And one of the reasons why we have the Night Watchman is because the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa were identified in one of those three studies, the Zimmerman Report, as a group that would be ready to be terminated. So those reports were prepared, they were passed on to Congress, and on August 1st, 1953, House Resolution 108 was passed. And the government rejected their previous ideas and went back to this, this assimilation idea. Outwardly, it was portrayed as something that was meant to liberate tribes from federal control. It was about, just outwardly they were saying things, but inwardly it had other purposes. So it passes in 1953. It goes through all the government branches. And what it really meant was it ends the recognition of tribal sovereignty. It ends trusteeship over Indian reservations. And it goes to the relationship between the state and indigenous peoples in regard to certain types of laws and things like that. So Turtle Mountain is identified in the Zimmerman Report as a place that that should be terminated. There were 10 reservations that were determined. One of the issues we have when we talk reservation and tribe is there are some reservations that have multiple tribes on it, and there are some tribes that exist on multiple reservations. So this referred specifically to reservations. And it was all about economics. And one of the things that the Zimmerman Report relied on was the report of Bureau of Indian Affairs agents and officials. So if you had an Indian agent on your reservation that was telling their bosses that you were economically independent and you were doing great, but that wasn't the reality, the government didn't know what the reality was. And that's what comes into play in The Night Watchman, because it is really about her grandfather's efforts as tribal chairman and his letter writing, which plays such an interesting part of the book. So her grandfather begins writing letters to political officials in North Dakota and in Washington, D.C., and eventually goes and testifies. And basically what he's trying to convince the government, and what he did convince the government, was that the tribe was not as economically self-sufficient as was portrayed in these reports. So he was able to convince, through his oration, through his writing, through his meetings, that the Turtle Mountain people were really not ready for this step. So they were taken off the termination list because of the work of her grandfather and a few people. And it's just an amazing story. 109 tribes were terminated out of this policy from 1953, really through 1964. 2.5 million acres of trust land removed from tribes. Amazing loss. Horrifying loss for indigenous people. It was an odd situation. The U.S. government says this is our criteria for terminating. We're going to begin doing this. Some tribes, like Turtle Mountain, went to Washington, D.C. and lobbied and got their name off the list. Others took the U.S. government to court and were saved because of legal action. There were some groups that were saved simply because the U.S. government made mistakes in their reporting. It's really, as I've got on here, a metaphorical train wreck. The U.S. government really did very poorly in their enforcing of their new policy. Even with all their mistakes, there was 109 tribes that were terminated. The last two, the sort of the latest that came after 64, were the Northern Ponca in 1966 and the Tiwa of Texas in 1968. So we're looking at 50 some years since the last tribe was terminated. So even though that was the policy of termination, the U.S. government under Lyndon Johnson didn't pursue it anymore. So when Johnson became president, he looked at ending the official House Resolution 108, and he was unable to do it. So there was an unofficial understanding out of the White House that Congress would not pursue any more termination. And it wasn't until 1988, 20 years after Johnson, when House Resolution 108 was finally formally abandoned. And shortly after that, the U.S. government entered into what we would call recognition, which is basically an undoing of termination. And it's a process where the U.S. government presented what we call a criteria for acknowledgement. So any group that had been terminated or had never been recognized, they were then able to go through this process to be reinstated or recognized by the federal government as a federally recognized indigenous nation. And on the left on the slide are really the 7 criteria that the U.S. government uses to do this. Continuous identity since 1900, distinct and existing community, a political influence or some kind of authority or some kind of political structure since 1900. They have some sort of governing documents that lay out their existence and relationship. They have to have descent from a historic tribe, but also have to be a distinct and separate group of a recognized group. And then they have to meet these requirements. And the U.S. government kind of enforces some more than others. So for example, the Northern Ponca, one of the last groups to be terminated in 1966, they were restored in 1990. And it was a difficult fight for them. And I have on the slide here the no reservation caveat. As their paperwork proceeded through the U.S. government, it was sailing very quickly. And then when it got to Congress, the local congressmen and senators would not support it because they feared that the Northern Ponca would pursue a land base. So the only way the Northern Ponca could be re-recognized was to have in their Restoration Act that they wouldn't pursue a formal reservation. So while they have, the U.S. government has gone back on this assimilationist ideas that they began way back in the 1800s and then brought back in the 1950s, they are still in the recognition process. Not fully recognizing the rights of indigenous people and not providing them the same opportunities as other groups. And we've seen in this recognition process issues relating to casinos, land bases, issues like that. So tribal peoples today that are seeking recognition sometimes have to choose not to have a land base or not to pursue a casino, not to pursue opportunities that should be legally afforded to them. But the government, again, as it is done for hundreds of years, will not sort of fully back up their promises. So The Night Watchman is a really wonderful piece of fiction that is rooted in a historic reality. It tells a wonderful story about Erdrich's grandfather and the process he went through to keep his people recognized. And without his work in the 1950s, we would have one less Indigenous community in the state of North Dakota. And she does a wonderful job of telling us this amazing story couched in this world that she creates of characters, of culture. She's teaching us about Ojibwe, Chippewa culture within this wonderful setting. So at this point, we will stop and take questions from the crowd. Those of you that are watching on video, thank you very much, and thank you for tuning in. You have a question?
How many of the tribes have gone through and been recognized, or a percentage, you know?
I do not have that number on the tip of my tongue. It has been a long process. There are some groups that have been seeking recognition for decades and have not made it through the process. The recognition process is a contested one because there are those criteria that the U.S. government has set out. And groups petitioning have to provide information and make their case. So it gets difficult to meet that criteria because if they push, so a connection to the land, you know, historic leadership, these can be difficult to prove. And if you can't prove it, they don't recognize you. So there's been some success stories, and there have been lots of failed attempts. You can go to the Bureau of Indian Affairs webpage, and you can search for the federal recognition process, and they have publicly listed the groups that are in process and where they're at in that process. It's a complicated matter. There are some groups that petition, but then don't complete their application, and they use that to get nonprofit status and to apply for grants. And so there's possibly some abuse of the system, which is a very hot topic in Indigenous circles. Most of the groups now that are, it's a good question. Most of the groups that are probably going to be recognized probably have been. There are a few that are in process now that have pretty good chances. But it takes a good relationship with your state, with your local authorities, with your congressmen, your senators. There's a whole set of things that have to line up really to make it easy on a group.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And the full listing of other related events to the Night Watchman is on our website. We have a website dedicated to it, and that is one numeral one book one community.org. Thank you very much.